Hello and good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today for PGR's webinar. Today our focus will be on the R2 standard, its integration with ISO 14001, 18001 OSAS, and the RIOS standard. We will be discussing the standards, their requirements, and some strategies to consider when developing an integrated management system. So my name is Tony Karpinski. I'll be the presenter for today's webinar. I'm an environmental health and safety specialist here at Perry Johnson and work out at the headquarters here in Troy, Michigan. I'm an executive committee member and the lead auditor for several standards, including ISO 9001, EMS ISO 14001, OSAS 18001 R2, RIOS BA 9000, and soon to be lead auditor for the medical device standard ISO 1345. So today's session, about an hour. We'll break it up about 40-45 minutes presentation and take some questions towards the end, last 10-15 minutes. But essentially today's session is covering the R2 integration. We'll start with a brief overview of the standards we're looking to integrate here, and then go into the PDCA cycle, or plain new check act model for these standards. Cover some key areas of integration, cover the certification process, and finally wrap up with questions you may have regarding integration with the standards to R2's 2013 standard. So let's get started. ISO sets out, or ISO 14001 sets out the criteria essentially for environmental management system. It doesn't really state any requirements for environmental performance, but it just maps a framework so that the company organization can follow it to set up an effective EMS system. It can be used by any organization of size to basically mitigate environmental issues, tap resources, reduce waste, and drive down cost ultimately. OSAS 18001 is a British standard, international British standard for occupational health and safety. It helps all sorts of organizations put in place a sound occupational health and safety system that will perform over time, obviously with continual improvement, better and better. It's not the only recognized health and safety standard, but it's one of the most prominent. We'll talk about another one a little bit later. But getting into R2, which is the root of this webinar, R2 2013 was introduced by Responsible Recycling, now known as SERI, or Sustainable Electronic Recycling International. The R2 standard is a set of guidelines for use by electronic recyclers to promote better environmental health and safety, security practices for end-of-life recyclers of electronics. This guide covers, the standard covers computers, laptops, LCD monitors, peripherals, cell phones, television sets, recyclers for refurbishment or recycling processes. I think most of our crowd today is probably recyclers, so the standard R2 and RIOS I'm sure you're pretty familiar with, or you're interested in getting familiar with. RIOS, the last one here, was introduced by Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, or ISRI, and RIOS stands for Recycling Industry Operating Standard. And this standard kind of encompasses all the major standards, quality, environmental, and health and safety management into one standard, and specifically caters to the scrap recycling industry. So moving on, all these standards follow the PDCA cycle, or they don't maybe explicitly say it, but they do for managing a management system. They're a model for continual improvement. And so these four parts, starting with planning, organization has some planning requirements that essentially will define their quality environmental health and safety practices, or footprint. And footprint kind of is a term that's coming from RIOS, but it's the boundaries of the system, legal requirements, environmental health and safety requirements, and quality for RIOS. and basically involves improvement planning so that the organization can plan effectively and then begin to carry out and implement what they've planned. Now, the implementation requirements, would detail training those employees on policies, getting the training of employees on the standard operating procedures of activities that are occurring at the facility, then communicating those procedures once they've created them, and putting operational controls in place to mitigate identified environmental, health and safety aspects, impacts, or health and hazard risks. And other parts of the implementation process would be putting and installing an emergency preparedness and response plan, whereby you would make sure you're accounting for and planning for and training your employees to handle spills, releases of toxic material, exposure to hazards, things of that nature, or even obviously medical emergencies, hazardous weather, things of that nature. The third part, the checking and corrective action requirements, details monitoring, measuring, making sure devices are calibrated to ensure quality or health and safety, or environmental practices, making gauges or making sure there's checks and balances. For example, a forklift daily inspection log is filled out to ensure that we're in compliance with potential legal issues surrounding maintenance of those items. Nonconformities and corrective and preventative action. With the checking process, we want to make sure that we have a process in place to identify potential nonconformities. And all these standards are the root of the corrective action. The root of the continual improvement lies with identifying problems, addressing them, and mitigating them, and then effectively coming up with a solution that fixes them systemically. And lastly, the QEH&S management system audit. This audit can be the internal audit and or the environmental or health and safety compliance audit. Those audits go hand in hand generally, but they can be separate. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but essentially the internal audit should test the system, check the system against their requirements, against customer requirements, supplier requirements, so that the system is working effectively. Lastly, the management review requirements, or the ACT portion. That's where we take all the inputs of the system, your internal audit, your previous nonconformities, inputs from employees' complaints, and among other things. And the standards detail, especially ISO 914 and OSAS, all detail the inputs that are required for management review and associated outputs. The idea behind the management review process is to act upon issues that are discovered, ensuring that continual improvement takes place, and that's the whole point, is to improve over time. So moving on, key areas of integration for implementation and auditing applications we'll talk about during this presentation. So we have R2, manual scope policy, which we'll discuss here next, objectives and targets, internal audit process, monitor maintenance, calibration, management review, legal compliance plan or compliance evaluation audit, environmental health and safety impacts, risk identification and assessment, operational controls we'll take a look at, in addition to nonconformance, correction, preventative action, and then lastly training, document records control. So those are some key areas where we can integrate the standards. There's a lot of overlap. That's how the standards are written, so that they can be easily integrated. And as the new versions have come out, we see a trend towards more and more integration, or capability of integrating these standards. And that's a good thing. It makes our life a little bit easier. And we'll talk about the benefits of integrating a system, so having an integrated management system put together. So, does the R2 standard require a manual? So is there an R2 manual requirement? This is always kind of a question. Do we need it? Do we not? But the real answer is no, not really. There's no direct requirement, but you kind of sort of have to have a manual in a way. You don't have to call it a manual, but and we'll get kind of talking about that a little bit throughout this presentation, particularly this slide. So you don't explicitly need something called a manual, but there'll be an assortment of documents that make up your management system that basically forms a manual. And so let's talk about some things here. So R2 provision 1 deals with the environmental health and safety management system shall be certified to an accredited management system standard. This is a new requirement for the R2 2013 transition, and right now the only currently acceptable options for recyclers are to be certified to both ISO 14001 and OSAS 18001, or to be R2 and RIOS certified. So those two options will satisfy the requirement. However, companies can propose alternative options to SERI if they desire to achieve the requirements by some other means. Perhaps new standards like ISO 45000 that's coming out that deals with health and safety issues might be a potential other solution, but we'll see. But all these standards require documentation in one facet or another, but really none of them explicitly require a manual per se. Moving on to the scope, and R201A1 requires a scope of activities. The scope of the organization can vary between standards. So if you have an integrated system, you have 1418 and R2, your scopes can vary between the standards, and your certification body will issue separate certifications for each integrated standard. Provision 2 requires policy for managing used and end-of-life electronics. It's expected that this policy be understood by all employees and communicated to downstream vendors. And this is a key area of integration where you want to make sure that when you have an integrated management system that you have a policy, a single policy that's integrated that addresses the requirements from 1418 R2 or from R2 RIOS, addressing a framework essentially in the language of the standards, framework for setting objectives and targets and achieving those for continual improvement, and among other things for detecting nonconformities so that you can continue to improve. So it's important to look at the standard requirements for the policies for each standard and then blend those together into a cohesive integrated policy. So again, while the organization may indeed have a variety of documents that integrate their system and their activities, an R2 manual is not explicitly required. So moving on to objectives and targets, R2 provision 1C1 requires establishment of written goals and procedures covering and requiring the recycler to manage both on-site and downstream environmental health and safety. So EMS, or 14001, and OSAS both detail objectives and targets as a requirement in 433. And then RIOS has several, the other standards as well have several other mentions in other areas of the objectives and targets and what needs to be established. But RIOS, the establishment of goals are mentioned through the RIOS standard. So 2E, you're dealing with the policy as a framework for establishment of goals. Essentially communicating that policy, integrated policy, would allow you to establish a framework and communicate that to your staff and employees at the facility so that you can have everybody tied into the integrated management system. 3.1, important environmental impacts and health and safety risks. 3.2 details improvement planning written Q, H, and S goals. I know it says Q there, I just included that for the RIOS standard. But if you're dealing with 14, 18, and R2, it's just R2 requirements plus the environmental health and safety goals. Now those goals, as always, should have responsibility assigned some time frame to accomplish those goals and resource allocation to ensure that those goals can get accomplished in a timely manner to meet your long-term continual improvement goals. 4.16, training on awareness and contribution to the organization goals. This is one that's generally lacking from my experience auditing. Organizations can do a better job at empowering employees, especially floor employees, to live up to the expectations and live up to the goals of the objectives set by the organization. So having that policy in their face and is not the only thing that needs to be done. You need to make it kind of a living, breathing document and system so that they can really get empowered to help the organization achieve their goals ultimately. I guess that's easier than it sounds, but it's what the standards, I believe, are trying to achieve. Lastly, 4.3 operational controls, monitoring, measuring achievement and goals, making sure that you have a management review that allows you to review your progression towards goals. And we'll talk a little bit about some of these sections like training, operational controls, and coming up here. So moving on to the internal audit. This is a big one here for integration, pretty key. So R2 Provision 1C, recyclers shall develop documents, fully implement, review at least annually through internal audits, and update as needed the written EHSMS, and this is from R2. So ISO 17021 requires certification bodies like Perry Johnson to verify the effectiveness of the internal audit monitoring program. So we want to look at the effectiveness of the internal audit, ensuring that all requirements have been captured and that there's staff that's been appropriately trained, and more on that in a second. So with integration, there's the process-based versus clause-based audits, and when you're doing your internal audit with an integrated system, the process-based, where you're dealing with a process and applying the standards requirements to that process. So with any given process, you're going to have an interface of R2 regulations or requirements from the R2 standard. You're going to have 14 and 18 intersecting, health and safety and environmental issues intersecting in some process, whether there be waste streams coming out of that process, health and safety issues that need to be mitigated within that process. If a clause-based system is the way you approach it, which is the intent of the standard and the way that certification bodies audit you, that's going to expedite your internal audit, make it cleaner, make it nicer, versus the clause-based where you're just kind of going through and detailing, checking off boxes that this clause, and this clause was reviewed during the internal audit. It's a more cumbersome. So the process-based approach to internal auditing is key for timeliness of the internal audit, making the internal audit more efficient. All three standards, or all four, R2, and then ISO 14001 and 18001, both detail the internal audit in 455. RIOS section 5.3 deals with the internal audit. Now, to truly integrate the internal audit, you need integration of documentation. So procedures, SOPs, forms, all that documentation needs to you need to pull that all together to allow for your external auditors to come in and not look at multiple systems documentation. It needs to be one streamlined process of internal audit with 1418 R2 or R2 RIOS so that it expedites the time that your external auditors need to spend. And it's going to also expedite the time for your internal auditors to fill out just a single set of documentation. So the audit schedule should be integrated where you're covering all your clauses or basically all your processes with all the standards that you are certified to or getting certified to. Now, an important point here with training and competent auditors. Training competent auditors is key, and you want to make sure that your training requirements for your that you're setting for your internal auditors are capturing the standards that you're seeking to get certified to or are certified to. So if you're R2 RIOS, your internal auditor should have a good understanding of both R2 and RIOS. And it's helpful because RIOS has components of ISO 9001, the quality management system, to get them some background in the quality systems management system as well. So that's key. You should have an integrated single process for training your auditors to be able to handle all the integrated standards. Lastly, reports and corrective preventative action should be an integrated system where you capture them and all that. More on that a little bit later. So moving on to legal compliance. R2 Provision 3, recyclers shall comply with applicable environmental health and safety legal requirements. 3A, from R2 states that recyclers shall develop a legal compliance plan to maintain full compliance with all environmental health and safety legal requirements applicable under its operation. 3A3, recyclers shall keep the legal compliance plan up to date, identify and implement the necessary steps to comply with each requirement, and document this. This includes periodically auditing its compliance with legal requirements. And this is paralleled these R2 clauses in ISO 14001 and OSAS in the requirements clauses 432 on legal and other requirements, and 452 for both 14 and 18 for evaluation and compliance. RIOS similarly has sections 312 for legal product and other relevant requirements, and also details in 512 the environmental health and safety compliance component. So there's a massive overlap here for integration. Again, integrating your legal and other requirements and compliance evaluation, it's important to get forms and procedures integrated into one system, one set of documents, so that you can take a look at and capture all the effective legal requirements that are applicable to your organization. And then there should be some audit schedule that allows you to effectively review the legal requirements and your compliance to those legal requirements and other requirements. Now, it's important that when you're doing your compliance evaluation or audit, this can be included as a part of your internal audit. It could be an ongoing thing or something separate entirely from your internal audit. But it should be done by a competent auditor internally. You can have somebody internally trained to handle this, making sure that they have adequate resources and expertise to make sound judgments on legal compliance. Or you can outsource to an independent party that would come in and take a look at your legal compliance. So making sure that you're capturing your wastewater permits or air permits, those are, there's some sort of system in place, an integrated system that pulls together your health and safety and environmental R2 or RIOS requirements into one system. Capture those, and there's a way to track when there's going to be expired certificates to ensure that someone is charged and responsible for keeping those up to date as required by the standard. And again, if there's any non-conforming compliance issues, that those are captured effectively in your reports from the compliance audit, and that they're captured by your single corrective and preventative action system. So monitor and maintenance and calibration. R2 talks about this in 4E. The recycler should use monitoring and sampling protocols to effectively manage risks identified in your management system, in your integrated management system. So ISO 14001 and 18001 detail these monitoring maintenance requirements in 451. RIOS talks about it in 513. And truly you want to make sure that you're, again, going through your system, capturing into a single forms and documentation standard operating procedure for capturing all those monitoring and maintenance requirements. Calibration records, maybe there's one log that records, gauges, scales, things that need to be calibrated so that they can be tracked in one location. Integrating preventative maintenance schedules and documentation is key to integrating in this area. So on-site environmental health and safety, R2 Provision 4, recyclers shall use practices and controls at its facility that protect worker and public health and safety and the environment. 4C, recyclers shall conduct a hazard identification assessment of occupational health and safety environmental risks. And 4D shall manage environmental health and safety hazards, strategies to implement and maintain controls, including but not limited to engineering, administrative, and PPE. So this is from R2, and those are paralleled in clauses 431 on either environmental aspects and impacts, or from 18, 431 talks about identification of hazards and risks. And then 446, we're dealing with operational controls. In the RIOS standard, it's pointing to the parallel 311 and 433. And as a whole, you're making sure through your integrated system that you're capturing all your environmental, health, and safety aspects, impacts, hazards, and risks in one location, one system. You have a rating system for both, or maybe rating the significance of those aspects and impacts, so that operational controls can be put in place to mitigate potential mishaps that you've identified, some strategic points to put controls. Those operational controls and those operational control procedures can integrate your environmental and health and safety R2 requirements all in one document if it's done. And the whole art of procedure writing is cumbersome, so consultants are helpful in that regard to help you write documentation that's not ultimately going to be a burden on you, and document it in a very an efficient manner so that you don't have huge, massive documentation. The idea is to get clean documentation, specific documentation that meets the requirements, and get rid of any of the excess junk, and streamline your system. So making sure for the integrated system, again, to integrate your operational control procedures and your identification of environmental health and safety risks, capturing those in one place. So integrating the identification process, maybe when you are going out to look at, let's say, sorting or a receiving area, you're looking at both in the receiving area hazards, trip hazards, fall hazards, or unloading hazards with proper ergonomic techniques for health and safety, but you're also looking at environmental health and safety issues with potential spills, releases of toxic material when you're moving it off the truck, things like that, where you can, when you're assessing and identifying these health and safety and environmental issues, you can do an integrated process and capture those so that you can mitigate them with appropriate integrated operational controls. So management review, this is another very, very key area that your auditors, when they come on site to do an integrated audit, are going to be looking at and making sure that it's fully integrated. Management review, so R2 discusses in 1C, recyclers shall develop, document, implement, and review at least annually 1C1 review of written goals and procedures, 1C2 written documentation necessary to show conformity and commitment to take corrective and preventative action to address nonconformances. The R2 really doesn't use the language, the R2 standard doesn't use the management review language explicitly, but through the plan, do, check model, it implies it. And because there's a requirement now in R2 2013 for 14 and 18 or RIOS, those standards explicitly call out in clauses 4.6 for both 14 and 18 and section 6 the management review process as a means of acting what you've done in your management system and keeping it in check. So integrating your management review, again, integrating your management review procedure, making sure you're capturing all the requirements, inputs of all the standards, integrating your agenda and minutes to capture all the standards. Any reports or corrective preventive actions are coming in as a single process, a single capital log perhaps, that captures the whole system. And so a single management review should address in an integrated system all the standards, inputs, and outputs. And there should be some record of this that's documented as required by the standard. So nonconformance, correction, preventative action, nonconformance and CAPA, corrective preventative action. R2 discusses the requirement in 1C2. Recyclers shall show conformity with these requirements and commitment to take action to address any issues of nonconformance. So clause 453 of both 18 and 14, and then OSAS also has 4532 where it discusses the nonconforming process or requirements for nonconformances. And then RIOS section 5.2 and 5.2.1 also deal with this non-conforming, identifying, capturing, and corrective action implementation. So again, kind of you see a lot of your redundancy here, but integrating the documents and procedures for your identification of non-conforming through the different standards, identifying environmental issues, identifying non-conforming health and safety issues, having a single set of procedures that deal with the standard, deal with all the standard requirements in a single CAPA process that can capture all the non-conformances documented. Again, having a responsibility assigned, some time frame assigned, and resources that will allow for the correction, root cause analysis ultimately, and corrective action to take place effectively. And then your integration of records for this process. Now, training competency and awareness. This is a pretty important point here. Training competency and awareness is talked about R2, provision 4A. Recyclers shall demonstrate the expertise, knowledge, and technical capabilities of each equipment, component, and material that it accepts in a manner that is legal and protective of worker safety, public health, and environment. RD2A of R2 discusses administrative and work practice controls and regular documented environmental health and safety training that covers specific issues at the facility that you deem as a requirement. So sections 422 of both 14 and 18 and RIOS section 4.1 detail competency training and awareness for your staff and for your employees. So it's important to, again, identify based on your activities and processes what is the appropriate training for those individuals. In most cases, it's job duty, responsibility, checklist or document, or job description that is presented, and there's some requirements for education, competency, and training on that. Those also are generally integrated into a matrix of some sort, a training matrix that will capture all the requirements for the different personnel in the facility. Those requirements, you set essentially what you deem to be competent and what is required of that job, and you set the timelines that would effectively allow that training to take place and be verified that it's effective. So for an integrated system, getting your training documentation to, maybe it's an introductory training for new employees that captures, potential health and safety and environmental risks at the facility, legal requirements that they should be aware of when doing their work or their job. So that's up to you how you define those requirements, but they need to be defined, and you need to have a timely process, an effective process for getting your employees trained to all the components of the standard which would they interface. And in addition to regular employees, your internal auditors, again, just to reiterate that, if you have your internal auditors for your internal auditor compliance audit, they again need to have all the standards covered and have knowledge and be competent in all the standards in order to integrate and integrate it, or in order to audit an integrated system effectively. If you have an independent party coming in, also if you're contracting your internal audit or compliance evaluation, those folks coming in should also be evaluated, and their competency should be tested to ensure that they can integrate or handle an integrated management system. So record documentation control, R2 provision 13. Recyclers shall maintain all the documentation necessary to demonstrate conformance to the R2 2013 standard. Parallel clauses in 14 and 18 are 4.1, 4.44, 4.5, and in RIOS 1.1, 1.2, 2.0, and 3.2. Now, this is a huge area. Obviously, we've talked basically about this the whole time where we're integrating our system. So, you know, we need standard operating procedures to capture all the integrated standard requirements. You need a single nomenclature for your document control, way of identifying the documents, you know, time frames for dealing with obsolete documents or handling obsolete documents. So this would include, you know, an integrated policy, manual if you choose to have one, which essentially you do in the form of all these documentation and records. Whether you call it it's a manual or not is up to you. But then, you know, integrating effectively your goals and objectives, internal audit, management review, these things we talked about. And then here's a key element, this interaction of elements and processes, the process flow diagram, which is something that PGR is specifically looking at a little bit more closely. Our auditors should be acquiring that document, which is detailed in section 444C of ISO 14000 and 18001. That clause essentially says that you should have an interaction of elements, and those elements should be, you should have references to related documentation, essentially to meet that requirement. So it can take many forms, but generally this interaction of elements, we do have another a webinar, an old webinar on this topic if you want to check it out at pgr.com. But essentially this interaction of elements, there's no really one way of doing it, but again it takes the form of a process flow diagram, generally coming from like you know, taking the process flow of all your activities and drawing some arrows between those processes to how they interface with one another. Generally, what's lacking from this diagram is the reference to related documentation. So if you have a process that you've identified that has some waste streams, those waste streams are elements of the system and should be documented on this interaction of elements diagram. And there should be reference to operational controls that would mitigate potential issues with whatever that waste stream is, the releases of it or potential contact of it with this toxic substance of the waste stream with your employees. So that interaction of elements is key for our auditors to identify your processes however you call them, whatever you call them, and then use that to construct the audit plan and audit your system effectively. So with an integrated audit, it should capture your whole system, your health and safety elements and processes, your environmental health and safety, recycling processes in one place. And it doesn't have to be a flow diagram. There's other ways to do it. A matrix form may work, and there's other things to explore to capture this requirement as well. Lastly, integrating operating control procedures, as we talked about, which is important. So a summary of benefits. There's a lot of benefits. So integrated audits, audit time can be discounted due to integration. That's the main key here, is that when you have proof of a fully integrated system, that we basically talked about all the requirements, but we'll reiterate them here, that you can receive significant discounts for this integration. So that's one of the major benefits. But we want to make sure that the integration is full, so integrated audits by internal auditors that are qualified for all standards being integrated, one corrective action system to manage systems nonconformities, a single management review addressing all standards inputs and outputs, integrated policy procedures manual, competency training records handled by one system, contractor supplier management, handled by one system. For environmental health and safety, integration, a single compliance audit, and this could all be, if it's done efficiently and effectively, can be done and accomplished by a single management representative. I suppose it depends on the size of your organization. It may not always be possible, but if it's done right and over time through continual improvement, that should be the goal here, to get one person charged with that allows some freedom for the others to do other things. So Reduction in procedures, forms when you're integrating. So instead of having all these separate forms for all the different standards, a huge benefit is to streamline your system. You'll have less upkeep ultimately, and the margin for error in your management system decreases substantially. So when the auditors come in, it's straightforward. There's a single documentation of your management review, for example, and it's easy to audit, captures all the requirements effectively, and you can make it streamlined so that you have less margin for error. So systems that are not found to be integrated, fully integrated at the stage 1 or subsequent audits, if something happened, will result in PGR increasing the audit time. So there's a major difference between simultaneous versus integrated audits, and this is a very key point for your integration if you decide to integrate. Audits can be done simultaneously. You could have an auditor come on site or 2 auditors come on site and do your 1418 R2 or an R2 RIO combined audit. So a combined audit or simultaneous audit is not an integrated audit. So while you have it being done simultaneously, the documentation requires twice the work if there's 2 standards, or if there's 3 standards, 3 times the work. You got to look at all these different documents. The auditors have a lot more time than invested in taking a look at your system and making sure it's effective. So integrated audits are truly integrated by having the things we talked about today and basically streamlining your system. So again, putting a quality system or environmental health and safety system or R2 system in place, or RIOS system, one book of policies and procedures that are not integrated is not an integrated management system. So, and buying software that handles all these documents, again, is not an integrated system. Merging disciplines, putting the safety manager, environmental manager in one department is also not satisfying integration requirements. So again, it's really, really important that we integrate all our systems that can be integrated, our processes into one streamlined system so that's truly integrated to receive the benefits. So a couple other good reasons. Reducing duplication and cost of documentation or efforts, reduced risk and increased profitability, balancing conflicting objectives. If you have multiple documents, you may not be able to keep them in line with one another. Eliminating conflicts in responsibility and relationships. If the documents aren't written kind of coherently, they can cause some issues with those responsibilities, and it's going to cost you time and money ultimately if people aren't on the same page, literally. Diffuse the power of the system. Turning to an integrated system will allow you to focus more on business goals once the system's streamlined. It allows you to harmonize and optimize practices, create consistently, ultimately improve communication, and facilitate the training and development of the system over time. So real quick, we'll go through some of the basics. We don't have too much time here. We're 43 after. So certification process for if you're intending to get certified to any of these standards, the process is the same. So first step, it's important to contact your certification body early in the process so they can help walk you through some issues. Obviously, we're aware of common issues and problems, so that's important to kind of get a good feel early on for what the registrar is looking for and what your auditors will be looking at when they come out to do an on-site visit. So training your staff to the standard requirements for internal audits, getting your internal auditors up to speed on the multiple standards. Creating an integrated system is easy if you already have some of these standards in place, which most of you do. If you already have a R2 in place or 14 in place, adding 18001 or another standard like ISO 9, they all kind of fit together really nicely. As you see from this presentation, there's a lot of parallels and overlaps that make integration pretty darn simple, although there's a lot of work up front, but it's pretty straightforward once you get going down the road. So implementation requirements, you need to conduct internal audit of the system. That's a full system audit prior to your stage 1. Conducting compliance evaluation of your legal requirements and other requirements. conducting a review of the system based on inputs from the internal audit. So conducting that management review is essential prior to your stage 1. It doesn't always happen, but that's generally what certification bodies are looking for. So after you get all these things, again, contacting certification body, getting the ball rolling, completing your stage 1, stage 2 audits, and if there's any nonconformities, addressing those, and then getting certified. But the stage 1 audit, so that the initial audit consists of 2 stages. Stage 1, which is on-site documentation review for your system, your integrated system. The stage 1 is going to look at that documentation and see if it meets the standards requirements. Additionally, you're going to be evaluated at that stage 1 for your readiness for the organization to move on to stage 2. So, in the event that your organization's not ready to move on, there's a process that we go through to acquire the required documentation. If there's any nonconformances, those need to be closed out prior to moving to stage 2. And 2 weeks prior to stage 2 is sort of the cutoff for that. Your auditor should be working with you, and we'll be working with you to close out any issues at stage 1 so that you can move on and be ready for stage 2. Now, stage 2 is scheduled generally 30 to 75, generally about 60 days after the stage 1 audit. It's an on-site audit of your entire system, and nonconformities have to be resolved prior to issuing the certification. So if there's any issues or gaps in the system, you need to go through correction, root cause analysis, and corrective action to show and demonstrate that those have been effectively addressed. After your initial certification audits, you have the whole audit cycle, moving on to surveillance audits, which are either scheduled at 6-month or 12-month intervals, depending on whatever your contract is set up like. That can be recommended by the auditor that we go with a semi-annual 6-month cycle or a 12-month. But you can also set that up. If you're a larger organization and you want to do and have more frequent audits, then that can also be done. But this is a partial system audit, these surveillance audits. They're not going to cover every process. As audits are, they're sampling. This is sampling. The surveillance audits are sampling parts of your system and aren't doing the entire system. If you're on an annual cycle, you'll have annual surveillance 1 after your initial stage 2 audit. A year later, you'll have your annual surveillance 1. A year after that, you'll have your annual surveillance 2, and then you'll come across the recertification audit at the end of the 3-year cycle. And this is an on-site audit conducted prior to your 3rd anniversary of the initial certification audit. And this is a full system audit. It's going to look just like your stage 2 did at every process, and go through your system thoroughly to make sure it's still intact and still effectively implemented. Surveillance visits will then continue as before on a 3-year cycle and continue the process. So what's available on our website to help you through this? If you need R2 lead auditor training for your internal auditors, we have accredited courses for R2 by Siri. We're offering 2 R2 courses, a lead auditor course and a lead auditor transition course. These are 8 hours online, working at your own pace, good e-learning. Certifications are presented to you upon completion if you pass the exam. And the price is approximately, is $295 for the lead course and $195 for the lead auditor transition course. We also additionally, at pgr.com, it's kind of on the lower left of your screen, an accredited RIOS lead auditor program or course as well. This is a course accredited by ISRI. It's an 8-hour course, again, working at your own pace, and certification gets you the course gets you a certification if you pass the examination at the end. The fee is $295, and those certifications for both of these courses, or all these courses, are good forever. So check it out. It's a pretty good price, pretty good deal. And now let's see if we have any questions. I would like to thank you all for your time today and coming to check us out. We're going to be doing some webinars in the new year. that will address some of the changes and transition to the new standards, or the revisions of the standards, sorry. So if you haven't heard, ISO 9000 is undergoing revisions here first, then coming down the pipeline shortly thereafter, we already have ISO 14000, a draft international standard that was released in July. The final draft of the international standard is going to be for 14 is going to be out in February of 2015, so in a few months. And the international standard, the final version, is going to be maybe third quarter of next year, with a transition period of about maybe 18 months or so. There's lots of changes to be coming. We'll have some additional webinars on 14's revisions. We have one for 9 coming up. And those are going to be some big changes to the OSAS 18001, because that's transitioning to an entirely different standard, ISO 45001. And currently this is in developmental phases. Second quarter here, I believe, of 2015 is where we'll get some final draft international standards coming out for this, and release fourth quarter, maybe 2016, of the actual standard. There's a lot of similarities again, so integration is definitely possible with these. So look for those on the website. So let's see if there's any questions here. Just bear with me a moment. So the one question here is, you mentioned internal audits, or I mentioned internal audits for ISO 14 and 18 or RIOS. So I mentioned that the environmental health and safety compliance audits are a requirement. Is there a requirement also for conducting R2 internal audits? Yes, there is, and the language essentially states that the system should be reviewed in the R2 standard annually, and that should be a full system audit covering all your processes, looking at your significantly identified aspects and impacts and risks and hazards in your recycling practices to ensure that you have an effective system. So because of the 2013 R2 requirements, that's all kind of tied together now if you're R2 14, 18. That's why integration is really critical, I feel, to streamlining it. And I don't know why you wouldn't integrate the internal audit. It's only really going to make your life a lot easier ultimately when you have, your auditors all trained appropriately and conducting one system audit of your internal management system. So I hope that answers your question. Let's see if there's any other questions here. So for a company that is being certified for the first time with a system that has been in place for less than a year, where their procedure states requirements of annual internal audits, there may not be an internal audit conducted. How do you handle this situation? So for these internal audits, I mean, it's good to start, again, like I said, starting the conversation with the certification body early. If you don't have your internal audit completed, again, it should be a full system internal audit, and there should be management review conducted prior to stage 1. There's many instances where that doesn't happen at all, So the way that we typically address it is we're looking at where are you at in the progress of doing your internal audit. So your auditor, when they're on site at stage 1, if you haven't completed your internal audit or management review, that will be cited as a non-conforming issue, and at stage 1 it's going to be cited as a non-conforming issue. When you move on to your stage 2, and before I guess you move on to your stage 2, you need to address how that situation with you not having your internal audit and management review is going to be rectified. So you should be putting together some meetings and plans in place, putting together and showing your auditor what the plan is for getting your internal audit done and completed prior to the stage 2 audit. So again, if you don't have it completed, you'll get a non-conforming issue, but you have to address it coming into stage 2, and if it's still not done at stage 2, you're going to receive a major nonconformance. And that's essentially a showstopper if you don't have, if you get a major nonconformance because you don't have an internal audit or manager review completed, you need then to have a very quick time frame. You only have about 60 days to get that completed, make sure it's effectively done, that you have your complete internal audit done, so that you can close out that major finding. So, again, contact us or the certification body to discuss that. You can call me or call Scott Jones. I'll have the contact information here up on the screen, so you can give me a ring. We can discuss that further, but that's generally how it's handled. Let's see here if there's any other questions. So a question is that I would like to be to tie R2 into 9001-2008 standard for my company. Is it necessary to be certified to the 14001 standard? So yes, with the new R2 2013 standard, as mentioned, I think one of the early slides, there is a requirement that the environmental health and safety management system be certified now to 14001 standard or OSAS, or sorry, 14000 and 18001 OSAS or RIOS. So I hope that makes sense. So if you're R2, you need to be either 1418 both or RIOS. And so it looks like if you're R2 already, I don't know, but if you're not, RIOS may be the answer for you if you're going to do if you want to incorporate a lot of the 9001. Those RIOS addresses a lot of the quality from 9000 and addresses 14 and 18. But for R2, R2 is requiring either that you have 14 and 18 together or RIOS to satisfy its requirement for the environmental health and safety certified management system. Okay, so again, if you have any additional questions you want to talk it through, if anything's confusing, give me a call. Let's see, there's a couple other questions. So again, okay, so we have a question here about integrating, we have an integrated system, however the outputs are different. They have one procedure that outlines the requirements for ISO or RIOS, environmental health and safety, or R2, but 3 different records of internal audits. Is that okay? Is that considered being integrated? So basically one system with 3 outputs. Yeah, the procedures need to be integrated. You need to have your audit staff, again, competent enough to audit all those requirements of ISO, RIOS, 1418 and R2. And for it to be truly integrated, you should have one audit report that captures all the requirements. So compiling all those into one place, because the whole point, again, to reduce your time on the integrated audits is for your external auditor from your CB or Karen Johnson coming in. If I were to come in and look at your documentation, I'm going to have to spend a lot longer time looking at these multiple documents, and so the system is not truly integrated at that point. So again, the idea is to streamline and get a single documentation of that system, of the internal audit, so that you can effectively mitigate the audit time. See if there's any other questions. So the presentation, question, request, a comment, my presentation includes lots of good information about which specific areas of each standards correlate. You have a list in a format that you could share. I'll see if I can get something up, but I believe the RIOS standard, a couple of the standards have correlation tables in the appendices. I believe RIOS has that. Several of the standards do. But RIOS has correlations to all the clauses for 9, 14, 18 and how they interact. And this presentation is also going to be provided to you if you need it. It'll be available, the recording of it will be available on pgr.com here shortly, and you should be receiving an email with the presentation in a PDF format for your references. But I'll see what I can do to see if we can post something. But we don't want to step across the lines of consulting, but as a reference document that may be possible, so I'll look into that. I think that's about it with the questions. Hope I addressed anything, but if not, hope I addressed everything. But if not, again, give me a call here in the office. You can call the main line here. You can ask for Tony or Scott Jones. I don't have his contact information up here. I'll have to put that on to the final presentation. But ask for Scott Jones or myself, and we can discuss any questions you may have. So I thank you very much for attending the PGR webinar. And again, check our website often. We'll have some upcoming webinars, particularly geared towards transitions for 1418 or ISO 45001. And we also have some ISO 9001 transition webinars coming up here in the next week or so. So check back with us often. Thank you for attending, and have a good day.